I asked ChatGPT a simple question. I asked, are there any potential pathologies that may develop for a doctor who is very close to retirement, who lacks the skills required to work on a neonatal unit that admits very sick premature babies, and who is working in a hospital that does not have enough doctors and does not have enough nurses? And this is what ChatGPT gave me back. Yes, the answer was, and that there are a few potential pathologies that can develop. The first being burnout, which is emotional exhaustion, cynicism, or detachment, and feeling ineffective. This is extremely common in healthcare workers under chronic stress. Moral distress, knowing what care patients need, but being unable to provide it because of staffing, resources, training, or organizational constraints. Moral injury, a deeper, longer lasting psychological impact that can occur when clinicians repeatedly feel that they are participating in or witnessing care that conflicts with their professional and ethical standards. Chronic occupational stress. Persistent stress can impair concentration, memory, decision making, sleep, and emotional regulation. Adjustment disorder. If the work situation causes significant emotional or behavioral symptoms that interfere with functioning. Major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. Prolonged occupational stress can contribute to these conditions in some individuals. Compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress, particularly when caring for critically ill or dying infants. There are additional issues that can arise from these pathologies. Persistent fear of making a serious clinical error, loss of professional confidence, feelings of guilt or inadequacy despite systemic causes, hypervigilance and difficulty relaxing outside work, considering early retirement or leaving medicine altogether. Today's video is part 5 in my series on the individuals and institutions involved in the miscarriage of justice that led Lucy Letby to be incarcerated for murders and attempted murders that she did not commit. And it is specifically looking into John Gibbs, the third consultant who really pushed for investigation into Lucy and insisted that Lucy was the cause of the deaths on the unit. And the reason that I mention all of these potential pathologies is because, as we know, John Gibbs was close to retirement. He retired in 2019. And I think it's very likely that he was experiencing a lot of these pathologies due to his situation. We don't really know when John Gibbs graduated from medical school because there's nothing online. But what I was able to come back with was just based on what ChatGPT can elicit from the very little that exists online, that he probably qualified from medical school around 1980 to 1984. No idea where he went. That he probably completed his house officer and registrar training during the 1980s and then became a consultant after about 10 to 14 years of postgraduate training. And he started at the Countess of Chester in 1994, retired in 2019. So who knows if he was really ready to retire or if the Lucy Letby situation pushed him to do so. But I would imagine that given the terrible situation at the Countess of Chester in 2015, 2016, he was exhausted. His attention was divided. His training was old. I don't know what kind of new training he received throughout his career. He did write some papers. He wrote 3 specific papers that I won't go into. But I don't know what kind of additional training he got. But I imagine since nobody on the unit was prepared to care for level 3 babies, and in fact weren't even prepared to care for a level 2 babies, that it was all too much for him. And that he was running around, probably, this is my assumption, and I surmise, that he was running around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to deal with the nightmare that ensued at that hospital at that time. It appears that John Gibbs was the third to join the Gang of Seven. It was first Stephen Breary and then Ravi Jairam, and then John Gibbs got involved. He became concerned starting in 2015, but he says that what he calls the tipping point occurred in 2016 when two twins from a set of triplets passed away, and then the third triplet was removed from the hospital and survived. And he had been building this narrative in his mind since 2015 that Lucy Letby was always present for all of these collapses, which simply was not true. But because he had joined in on this horrifying witch hunt that had begun in 2015, by the time the collapses of the triplets, child O, P, and Q, occurred, he was right on board. And no wonder. Let's go into child P, who passed away while John Gibbs was on duty. The prosecution and Dr. Dowie Evans accused and later succeeded in getting Lucy convicted for murder by allegedly injecting air, overfeeding with milk, and dislodging the breathing tube. But the international panel of top neonatal experts found that child P's death was a natural one caused by pneumothorax that was suboptimally managed. So let's go into exactly what happened with child P. And let's remember that all of this was committed by Dr. Gibbs, who later decided that this was the tipping point. This is when Lucy Letby was certainly guilty of murder after this event. Let's look into this, though. This is the summary of what happened with baby P. Baby P was 33 weeks and 2 kilograms in birth weight and was a male triplet number 1 who was born by cesarean section and had mild respiratory distress and was put on continuous positive airway pressure, CPAP. But then at 16 hours of age, John Gibbs put this infant on nasal cannula, which is those 2 tubes that have little pieces that go into the nostrils and send oxygen through the nostrils. So this child was taken off CPAP, which helps clear airways, and put on nasal cannula, which does much less, probably in the hopes that the infant could take it. Unfortunately, the infant could not and developed apnea, which means the infant stopped breathing. The abdomen was full and mildly distended and was soft with no tenderness and active bowel sounds. So antibiotics were started. And then the next day, he suddenly developed desaturation and low heart rate and was intubated and ventilated with high pressures. And he was given adrenaline. Now, a chest x-ray showed a moderately large right pneumothorax, meaning the right lung was very collapsed. And an hour later, he developed desaturation and low heart rate. But Dr. Gibbs did not notice the pneumothorax. He did not see that the lung had collapsed because he didn't know to look. Capnography showed the endotracheal tube had become dislodged, not noticed by Dr. Gibbs. The child was resuscitated and a new endotracheal tube was inserted. The pneumothorax was needled about 3 hours later after the first deterioration, and a chest tube was inserted another 2.5 hours later. The child had persistent metabolic acidosis, which means that there was too much acid in the body's fluids, and this can affect the heart, the brain, and other organs. And this was despite bicarbonate infusion. 1.5 hours later, he had cardiorespiratory arrest and died. So again, it was alleged that air was injected into the baby's stomach by nasogastric tube, which caused gastric distension and splinting of the diaphragm, leading to collapse. But that allegation has since been changed to air that was injected into his intravenous line, causing air embolism, collapse, and death. Just as often was the case with Evans and still is the case, causes of death were changed even after the conviction, which makes no sense and shouldn't be allowed, and is a major reason why Lucy deserves another trial. I believe she deserves complete exoneration without another trial, but if another trial is what needs to happen, it needs to happen. So that was the conviction. But the panel opinion was that the initial gaseous distension of the abdomen that was caused by the CPAP was not caused by injection of air into the nasogastric tube, but was again caused by the CPAP. And it is unclear whether the nasogastric tube was even open to drainage, which is a major mistake. The baby's care after the collapse on June 24th, which is when it happened, was mismanaged, and there were unacceptable delays in recognition and treatment of the pneumothorax, which I mentioned before. Delay in treatment of the pneumothorax led to persistent metabolic acidosis, too much acid in the body's fluids, because of persistent poor circulation and gas exchange caused by the pneumothorax. It is unclear whether the collapsed lung preceded or followed the resuscitation that happened. Pneumothorax can occur in preterm infants with mild respiratory distress syndrome, especially with CPAP or other respiratory support, or even without any lung disease or respiratory support at all. The medical records do not show that a cold light test was performed. He was treated with high pressure ventilation and adrenaline despite having no lung disease and requiring only 26% oxygen. Both of these things are harmful to a child like him because high ventilation pressures impede venous return to the heart, resulting in worsening circulatory failure. And adrenaline punishes the heart by overworking it unnecessarily. There were no signs, the panel says, of air embolism at final collapse. I share this information not to shame Dr. Gibbs. In a normal circumstance where Lucy Letby was still working and living her life and married and having the family that she dreamed of having and having the cats that she wanted and living in her beautiful home in Chester, in that world, I would never deign to shame John Gibbs for making a medical mistake because it happens. Now, I posit that it happened too much on this unit, and it probably was due to a certain level of burnout, a certain level of moral distress, a certain level of moral injury, of occupational stress, perhaps depression. I don't know. I'm not going to diagnose that. And definitely compassion fatigue, because that's common among most professionals. And considering the way Gibbs treated Lucy Letby, he had compassion fatigue. But aside from that, aside from whether it happened too much, whether the hospital was failing, whether the unit was a disaster, I would not point this out as being a mistake on his part, because who do I think I am? Except for the fact that it was that night that John Gibbs decided that Lucy Letby must be a murderer. Isn't that interesting? I wonder why a man who was responsible for the deaths of two premature infants, sadly, horribly, it must have weighed on his conscience, but I wonder why that man would suddenly find a need to really jump on board with the witch hunt. Because his conscience couldn't stand it. And judging from what he does now, I imagine he did have a lot of introspection and a lot of internal investigation. I think there are certain aspects of that internal investigation that he has put aside because he has to, namely Lucy Letby. But generally, I think he probably is an introspective person, and that's why he has become a priest at the Church of England, but with the Church of England. But aside from all that, clearly he carried a lot of personal responsibility and probably guilt for the disaster on the unit. He was one of the senior doctors, and look at what was happening. So she became a very easy target for somebody who was tired, stressed, burnt out, and lacked compassion because of all of that. There are certain aspects of John Gibbs's behavior that are unconscionable, just like Stephen Breary and Ravi Jairam. One of them is that at the Thirlwall inquiry, he blamed the nurses on the unit for the fact that he did not go to the police right away regarding Lucy Letby. He said the nurses pushed back so much that it made it impossible to go to the police. So even at that point, he was saying it was the nurses' fault. Even then, not Lucy, but the other nurses on the unit. It was their fault I didn't do something. It was their fault I didn't go to the police. If they hadn't been there, I would have done the right thing. Sound familiar? Does to me. Another child that John Gibbs did enormous damage to, that Lucy Letby was later convicted for attempting to murder, was child G. John Gibbs, on the afternoon of September 20th, 2015, fitted child G with an intravenous cannula behind a privacy screen in the nursery, meaning there was a screen covering the infant while he did the work on the infant. But what he failed to do was, number one, remove the screen so that everybody on the unit could see the infant at all times. And he failed to turn on the heart rate monitor. So later, when Lucy came upon the child, she saw that it was behind the privacy screen and that the heart rate monitor was off. And so she called for help because the child had collapsed, and help came. And the other nurse on duty witnessed the entire thing and was a part of the complaint against Dr. Gibbs later, that he had forgotten to turn on the heart rate monitor and that he had forgotten to remove the privacy screen, a huge problem. And she testified that John Gibbs later apologized to her for forgetting to remove the screen and turn off the heart rate monitor. But in court, John Gibbs said he doesn't remember that he doesn't think that's true. If the nurse says so, he said, I guess it must be true, but I don't remember that, which of course is playing into the power and to his socioeconomic place in the world over the nurses, and the jury fell for it. But he was an enormous reason why this child collapsed. And then later, Lucy Letby was held accountable for it. There are many cases like this with Gibbs, Breary, Jairam, and all the Gang of Seven, the other doctors involved in her persecution. But these are just a few that Gibbs himself was responsible for. He's clearly a tired, guilt-ridden man. And it's no coincidence, like I said, that he has become a priest. And now he preaches and lectures on medical ethics, ironically. But beyond that information, beyond the knowledge that he had to turn to God for forgiveness, I'm sure that God will give it to him, but it's hard for us to, I know. But this is a burnt out man, not prepared to be working on the unit he was working on, probably not qualified, regardless of his experience, not qualified, couldn't handle that level of infant in that hospital, which did not have the tools necessary to do so. And it became very easy, like I said, to turn it all around on Lucy Letby. And I only tell this part of the story and tell his place in the story because it's just another example of how human fallacy and human weakness and limitation played a role in her conviction rather than evidence and reality. Every single thing that Lucy was convicted of was based on flawed evidence, circumstantial evidence that meant nothing, and the stories of men like this, like Gibbs, who was limited, lost, exhausted, and shouldn't have been doing the job in the first place. And so instead of taking responsibility, he blamed it on her and then ran off to another institution to be cloaked in its protection. I feel sorry for him that he was capable of doing this and that he still hasn't taken responsibility. He kind of started to in the Netflix documentary where he acknowledged that nobody saw her do anything and they might have gotten the wrong person. There was no person, there was only themselves. Those were the people that they should have turned to when it came to the deaths and collapses of these infants, but regardless, he sort of acknowledged it. But it's time for him to step forward as a man of God and admit that he was wrong. Do it, Dr. Gibbs. Do it. Come forward. Be a true leader. Be a true religious man. Be a true spiritual person. Be a true hero. And help Lucy Letby be exonerated by acknowledging that you were wrong, you were fooled, you were tired, and you made a mistake. Just one last thing about John Gibbs, in case you think that he was just carried along on a wave of accusation. He was a big part of it. Here's an email that he sent about the possibility of there being air in the skulls of the infants that had passed on the unit, which, by the way, Dr. McConville on his podcast with Peter Elston pointed out that you can't see air in a scan, so he doesn't know where that's coming from. But regardless, John Gibbs, when emailing Breary and Jairam, mentions bacterial decomposition, and he says that air in the skull can happen because of bacterial decomposition, but then he goes on to say that depending on how often the babies were handled by their parents after death, if the bodies had been held by the parents for longer or shorter, if they had cooled enough and there was still air in their skull, then that was very worrying and an investigation should ensue. I'm not a doctor. I have no idea whether that's legitimate or not. It doesn't sound it to me, and Dr. McConville didn't think so either. And that's just an example of the ways in which he pushed this narrative as well. So he's not just a lamb being led to slaughter here. He was the slaughter. He was the slaughter.